April 3rd Metro Stormwater Management Commission meeting to order. My name is Kabir Sandhu. I'm serving as chair of this commission, and we would like to rearrange the agenda a little bit today. We have a representative from Metro Planning to present their update to the stormwater study that was done last year and their consultants. So what we'll do is we will move them to just after approval or after review of the meeting minutes and decision letters. So, and then we'll move on into the cases. We only have one case today, and that will be our meeting, it seems. Okay, so if there's no other comment on moving the agenda around, then we'll move forward. And the first item of business is to, as customary, review the meeting minutes and decision letters in public forum. And we'll allow the commissioners to take a moment to do that. And when ready, would like to entertain a motion.
I would move to approve the meeting minutes and the decision letters as presented.
Great. We have a motion. Is there a second? Motion's been properly seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Aye. Any opposed? And none abstained? Motion carries. Great. All right. Next item of business, I would like for the representatives here for the planning study to come to the podium and introduce themselves. And I believe we have a PowerPoint presentation. Our screens are not on. Oh, there they are.
Okay, I'm Dustin Shane with the Planning Department, and I want to give you all an update on our stormwater study. Next slide. So phase one is complete. We just got our completed report for that. As a refresher, that was initiated by Councilmember Druffel. There was a perception of increased complaints in certain areas of the county. I'll point out that in the process, speaking with water service personnel, they didn't think that there had been a disproportionate increase in complaints, and that's kind of a perception that the growth has actually tracked with population increase. But regardless of that, we did the study, looked at 4 hotspot areas around the county, the Nations, East Nashville, Buena Vista, and Green Hills. Next slide. Main results of the study, somewhat surprising, but no correlations were observed between stormwater infill permits, stormwater grading permits, and the runoff and flooding complaints. So what might explain this finding is that our stormwater infill regulations are largely successful that we've adopted here. We looked at 3 peer cities, Raleigh, Austin, and Atlanta, and found Atlanta had a lot of things that in common with us, but also some things that we could learn from, and that we were doing pretty good as far as our peer cities are concerned. Biggest takeaway was that most of the complaints could be correlated with a lack of infrastructure or inadequately sized infrastructure, which is fortunate because we have as y'all know, the ongoing stormwater master plan that's addressing infrastructure upgrades around the county, looking at different basins. Next slide. So where does that leave phase 2 though? Are there things we can do with the zoning and stormwater regulations, areas to improve? Next slide. Well, the study did identify a few areas for improvement in this realm, and those are basically 3 areas. The fact that there are some impervious areas not currently in the permitting process, the fact that we have a tree stormwater credit that's barely utilized in a lot of infill development, and the fact that there's no ISR or impervious surface ratio for 1 and 2 family uses. Next slide. So the first of those, impervious permitting, currently not permitted are pool decking, sports courts, parking pads, and driveways. So a lot of times water service staff will catch these on the back end and have to redo mitigation calculations. It's really just a big headache for them and for the applicants. So looking at how we can get those into our processes. Next slide. The tree credit, it's rarely, if ever, utilized in infill. Currently it applies, it's an option for trees that are 6 inches diameter at breast height or larger. And you can get up to 20% of a reduction in your impervious area mitigation by preserving trees. But staff relates that it's almost always more lucrative for developers to scrape sites, take down old trees. So one thing we want the consultant to look at is what are other cities doing that see a utilization of this credit? Potentially setback variances, making the credit more useful, giving greater mitigation for it, that kind of thing. And then finally, 1 and 2 family impervious surface ratio. We have that for commercial and multifamily uses, but not for 1 and 2 family. And so this actually, because water services is looking at this impervious area, codes is only looking at building area, building coverage on lots. So they're kind of speaking different languages. It's leading to different incentives when people are doing plans. So just equalizing that, getting impervious surface, what we look at across the board would help. So we want to look at what other cities are doing, make sure we're calibrating that ratio correctly. Next slide. So that's basically it in a nutshell. If y'all have any questions, we're looking at about a 10-month process, and we're just kind of getting the funding together right now and finalizing the scope. So.
Thank you, Mr. Shane. I do have one question. The correlation in your phase 1 study to determine whether or not infill was having a detrimental impact to flooding was based on the premise of collecting complaint data?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. And is that the only way to determine whether or not there's an impact to infill is by people? Some people may not pick up the phone or decide to call or use Hub Nashville or other means to voice their concerns. Mm-hmm. That seems to be a somewhat subjective method in some sense, but are there would phase 2 include other study methods to determine that as far as our stream performance and flow and those types of metrics?
Yeah, well, we kind of have to, with phase 2, we're kind of moving on from that question just because I think we could revisit that with a more extensive, data-intensive study, maybe across the whole county. But we found that there's a lot of data that's not digitized that would require its own contract and study to really get a complete picture. So we felt like what we looked at with phase 1 was kind of extrapolable to the larger picture. So we're fairly comfortable with the results that we observed with phase 1.
I mean, if you just look at aerials in these neighborhoods, the rooftops just pop over the last 10 years. Just
and
if they were a commercial site, it'd be, or a subdivision, there'd be a big old pond or there's just nothing.
And that's the emphasis of, in a sense, my question is that if the study's based on people who, it's like, I go to restaurants all the time, but I never write a Yelp review of whether it was good or bad. People who have, may not be experiencing flooding directly impacting their property, but their stormwater infrastructure may be at capacity and they don't know it.
I
So,
think the stormwater master planning effort is really going to dive into that, including looking at full build out in certain areas and what our current infrastructure can handle.
That's it. So I wanted to make sure that there's some correlation between these two as we move forward into phase two. Okay.
Yeah, and that was kind of our, when we saw it and we saw there was no correlation, we were like, how is that possible? But we have to remember that like Kimberly's team and what we're doing with the infill regs is mitigating a lot of that. Now, there are some gaps, you know, that or some means for enhancement that we could pursue, which is what we want to look at for phase two. But, you know, you're going from more impervious area, but also greater mitigation strategies on site on these lots, you know, bio retention ponds and so forth. So we think it's catching a lot of this extra runoff.
And I'd certainly applaud the work that was done and the input, and especially the comparison to our peer cities and what they do well or not well, or maybe what we do better. I'm sure we learned a lot in that sense. Do you recall what cities were used as peer groups?
Yeah, Raleigh, Austin, and Atlanta.
Okay.
And we really saw, Atlanta has the most similar kind of regime that we have for stormwater, but also goes a little further than we do on certain things. You know, they look at all impervious areas when they're doing their ISR and so forth. So I think they're going to be probably one of our peer cities we select in phase two to try to mirror some things from them. So
Excellent.
There is a lot of consideration to impervious surface with Kimberly's program because one of the most direct things that we do in the stormwater division and the part of the program that I run is the stormwater user fee. And so we capture those impervious surfaces. We know the amount of impervious surface on every non-residential parcel. A lot of the residential parcels, some 200,000 parcels, if somebody calls or complains or asks us to reevaluate their fee, we'll actually do a measurement of impervious surface. And that's everything. That's rooftops, that's sidewalks, it's a deck out back, it's the driveway to the street. So we consider all of that. And we warn people ahead of time that if you complain about your stormwater fee and we measure it, and it turns out to be more than what was originally, if your fee jumps from $6 a month to $11 a month, that's on you, because if that's what we find when we evaluate it, that we're going to change your stormwater user fee to the $11 fee. So, I mean, there's an enormous amount of work done with impervious surface. The complaints, you know, if a resident has a flooding issue and he's not calling if he's not using Nashville Hub or filing a complaint with our dispatch number, the 862-4600 number, it'd be like me calling a shoe repairman if my back hurt. You know, you gotta make your complaints to the very well-established lines of communication, because we've got crews that'll be out there tomorrow to find out why you've got a stormwater issue in your yard. We generally know where they are all across the city. We do upwards of close to $20 million a year in remediation work and drainage systems, and anybody with a clog in their driveway pipe, we can have that cleared in a matter of days, and we do it all over the city, all over the time. We have extensive data on the number of complaints that come in across all 35 council districts. For decades, we've got complaint data on that. So there's a lot of work done to investigate complaints. So.
Excellent. Thank you for that. All right. Any other questions, the study? And then when will we know about phase two? Is that in council's hands to approve, or how do we move forward? Next steps?
We'll go forward like we did for phase one. We'll get the contract. We've got kind of sources of funding that we can use, and we just have to go through the process internally to get that done. And then we'll be presenting probably early next year to the public and council. So.
Okay, great. Looking forward to that presentation.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Singh.
Thanks.
All right. Next item of business is our first case. If the applicant could come up to the desk here. And I will let Logan introduce the case.
Opening statement to the applicant. If you are not satisfied with the decision made by the Stormwater Management Commission, you may appeal the decision by filing for a writ of certiorari with the Davidson County Chancery or Circuit Court. Your appeal must be filed within 60 days of the date of the Commission's decision. You are advised to seek the independent advice of legal counsel to ensure that your appeal is filed in a timely manner and that all procedural requirements have been satisfied. Case number 1 on the agenda, case 2023-00017, 3817 Trimble Road, at 3817 Trimble Road. APN is 1300-701-00000. Inspector is Stormwater Single Family. Council District 34, Sandy Ewing. Applicant's request, allowance of an unpermitted structure to remain in the floodway buffer of Bellmead Branch. Allowance of disturbances to the floodway buffer of Bellmead Branch to remain. Continuous mowing and maintenance of portions of the floodway buffer. Uncompensated fill in the floodplain. Allowance of green infrastructure practices within the floodway buffer. Appellant is Jason R. Padgett, represented by Adam Seeger, P.E., Dell & Associates. Comments. Stormwater staff. Staff does not support floodway or Zone 1 buffer disturbances or violations of our floodplain management regulations. This case is the result of an enforcement action by MWS relating to parcel development in violation of Metro Code of Law and Stormwater Management Regulations, Volume 1, and was performed without the necessary permits. The illegal site work involves floodway disturbance for construction of a structure in the floodway. Staff recommends removal of the structure. Metro Code of Law 1564-170 states, no new structure shall be constructed in the floodway. Typically, this review would not be appealable to the Stormwater Management Commission. This is before the Stormwater Management Commission due to the perceived ambiguity in Metro Code Section 1564-170, Section F. Staff spoke with one of the original council members who sponsored the limited exception to that general rule found in 1564-170, Section F, about the intent of the exception to further inform this commission. As a reminder, 1564-170, Section F permits athletic fields in the floodway used for recreation purposes, including facilities associated with recreational athletic fields, such as dugouts, bleachers, concession stands, storage buildings, and other similar structures or facilities. The sponsor has confirmed this exception was meant for facilities like the soccer fields in Bellevue, metro parks, and certain private schools that hold public events. Should the Stormwater Management Commission agree this structure does not meet the exception, Metro Code of Law 1564-170 governs and the structure must be removed. Floodplain cut and fill balance considerations for the unpermitted material. Buffer disturbance for the installation of artificial turf. Artificial turf does not provide the benefits of natural vegetation and is designed to route water away instead of infiltrate into the soil. Based upon a comparison of aerial imagery, trees were also removed in the buffer. The applicant has not requested uncompensated fill, requested for the dry wells to be permissible within the floodway buffer, provided clear infiltration testing results performed within the artificial turf limits, not outside, shown the benchmark and vertical datum on the plan set, or provided a clear detail and installation picture showing what is located below the artificial turf. This is what staff would have expected to receive in order to properly review this buffer disturbance. In the prior meeting, the applicant brought up the lack of notice of these regulations. The site was included on mailers sent out for properties within the floodplain in 2017, 2018, 2020, and 2022, and also 2023. This mail out, included in your packet, references special permitting provisions required by Metro for work in the special flood hazard area. If a variance is not granted, staff will grant the parcel owner 30 days from the Stormwater Management Commission hearing date to submit a permit application to Metro Water Services that will bring the site into compliance with Metro Code of Law and stormwater regulations. Codes had no comment provided. Planning deferred to recommendation of the Stormwater Management Commission. Greenways denied. Greenways entry only speaks to it's not requiring a greenway conservation easement, not to the merits of the variance request.
Okay, thank you for that. I will, since we have some folks in the audience, I think that may be here to speak, I'll provide a rundown of the way that this works. The applicant has 10 minutes to present their case. I'll provide a 2-minute warning. At that time, we will close the hearing of that case and then open up to public comment. We will ask the folks to come up to the microphone and introduce themselves and provide their address. We will then, after the room is cleared of folks who are here to speak in favor or opposition of, we will close public hearing, and then we will open it up to the commission for discussion. And at that time, there may be some back and forth with the applicant. Okay, so with that, I know, Mr. Seeker, you've been here before and know the way this works. If you wouldn't mind, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourselves, and then I'll start the 10-minute clock.
So, test, yep. Adam Sager, Dale and Associates. We're at 516 Heather Place, Nashville, Tennessee. We're here as the civil engineer representing our client, Mr. Jason Paget. As was spoken, he's the owner of 3817 Trimble Road. Yes, we've been here before, and we presented that case. Just as a quick background, during the last time, there were questions about infiltration, there were questions about the structure, there were questions about the turf and so forth. And so we appreciate your patience with us. After that meeting, we went and ordered infiltration testing, and it takes a little bit of time to get somebody scheduled. They're very busy these days. And so it wasn't until I think the day before of the last meeting that we got those infiltration test results, and then it was decided to defer it, and that's why we're at this meeting and not the last one. We haven't been avoiding it at all. We just had to wait for the infiltration test to get back. When we saw the infiltration test back, and as a side note, I want to speak to some of the stuff that was just mentioned about doing infiltration in the turf area. I don't think that would be reasonable because it's all kind of one piece. If this goes forward, why would we go tear up all of that turf to do infiltration right in the middle? So we did the best we could and did infiltration tests on the side of it. I mean, immediately adjacent to the turf. We also went across the creek and did them around the house as well. They were hand dug. Mr. David Perry now with R.S. Miller Group, did the tests. And those tests and their infiltration rates were provided on the plan that we resubmitted. And they got good rates meaning they were higher than the 1/2 inch per hour that's required in Metro. I can pull it up. I think as listed, they were around 2-3 inches per hour, something like that. And so we started coming up with, well, how can we make this better? How can we mitigate the items that we did here? One of the things that we noticed was in the last meeting, it was mentioned, well, if you have all these infiltration in the turf, which we do, the water doesn't run off of the turf, it goes down to the ground. It goes into a pipe system. We followed that. We walked the site, and it comes out at a pipe that's right there next to the bridge that's been there. And that's where everything discharges. Well, if we were to cap that pipe and upturn it, that would create a storage area, a storage volume underneath all of the turf area where water can further promote infiltration into the ground. And so we've proposed that on the plans. That's one of the solutions that we're proposing. You turn the pipe up a couple feet, that provides another 2 feet of storage underneath all the turf area, help promote infiltration. There's 3 other items and areas we looked at where we got infiltration. One is the rooftop that was put in is about 498 square feet. And we designed a dry well to go right behind the roof. We can put a gutter on the roof, collect all of that, take it to a dry well, which is part of a best management practice in Metro regulations. That will go into the ground and infiltrate right next to where one of the infiltration tests was dug. In addition to that, because I know how past cases people want to see above and beyond these impacts, we measured rooftop on the existing house that's already there, and we're going to put a dry well on either side on the back part of the house. When you add up those practices, it's about 2.7 times more than what just that rooftop is right there. So we're trying to go above and beyond, like this board often asks of us. And I think that speaks to we're trying. We in no way can sit here and say, oh, this is something that's totally allowed in the regulations. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, right? So this isn't really like a technical kind of thing. Let's see here. Oh, there was a question about the structuralness of the structure itself. I call it an awning or just an outdoor pergola type of thing. It's timbers that have been bolted and concreted into the ground. It is very structurally sound. It would meet anything from a structural standpoint, from a floodplain. I don't think floodwaters will ever get up that high, but even if they did, it's an open air structure with posts sticking into the ground that's bolted into a concrete pillar. There's pavers there in the turf. Let's see here. So I come back to one thing that I can't get. I've been doing this a long time. This is a unique kind of case for me because I'm not representing a developer. I'm not representing a development or something that we're normally accustomed to. And I try to put myself in Mr. Padgett's shoes, and that's why I provided the recent pictures. When I walk in his backyard and I walk up and down this neighborhood, I provided a couple pictures, and if you can put those up on this, there's one. That picture is what you see when you stand in his backyard and you look downstream. Every single neighbor up and down here has walls along this creek, all of them. Every single neighbor has buildings and structures and bridges going over this creek, none of which would be approved. It's very beautiful, right? But you can see concrete basketball courts right up against the creek, all up and down here. This picture right here is a few houses above, and I looked it up. You can't really see it. I'm not going to go trespass in the guy's backyard. But the house on your left is about 10 feet away from the creek, and the fence on your right has a pool in it. That pool was approved in 2020, 2021, and it is in the floodway. It's like feet away from the creek. So as you tell me, if you walk up and down this neighborhood, how is Mr. Padgett doing anything different than what he sees all of his neighbors doing up and down the creek? So for me, it kind of turns into a little less of a technical situation and more of a innocence type of situation. What are we doing here? And I know I'm fully respective of precedent and what this board does, but I can't help but think this is more of a matter of forgiveness about ignorance. When I go to my kid and I talk to my 7-year-old kid differently than I talk to an adult because they don't know any better, because they're ignorant. I mean, we even have court systems that have juvenile court versus, adult court. And I know that's being a little dramatic here, but I kind of think that's the mindset of what I feel when I walk out here is that we're asking a guy who asked permission to put a pool in. Metro comes out, sees things that are already done, but yet he gets to go through this whole process, but nobody else does. And you can look at your screen, 2 properties to the left, that's all pavement in the floodway buffer, all of it. It's a basketball court, it's a driveway. And so I kind of asked this board, what kind of message are we sending in precedent if we have the mindset that we have to teach a lesson? I want to just recommend maybe we're careful with that and a little understanding. If he's learned his lesson, I promise you, he spent a lot of money just going through this process. From a technical standpoint, we are providing pretty hefty mitigation. This is mitigation that we're providing that none of the other neighbors are. And he asked permission, and now he's here before you. If this is not approved, it seems to me that the message would be, hey, don't ever ask permission, because if you ask permission, they're going to say no, and they're going to come after everything else that's out there. If you do grant forgiveness, it could be, thank you. If you do grant forgiveness, it would be more, hey, go ask permission, make sure you get your ducks in a row, because it's a really painful process to try to go through this. It's really expensive and really difficult. And so I've got other pictures and things we can show, but I appreciate your time, and thank you.
Great. Thank you for that.
And 2 minutes, yeah.
Yep. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think Adam covered it all pretty well.
Okay.
Like he said, this was not something I intentionally did. It was something that I had done, and I'm willing to, as he explained, go above and beyond what y'all would require normally to make this work, to make it where it's not a bad thing in any way. The perviousness of the sport, of the turf is, and y'all came out there and saw it. I mean, it's very, very pervious. And we didn't do any testing on it, but it's even better than what they tested. So again, I think Adam covered everything pretty well, so I don't think there's much else to add.
Okay, thank you. All right, this time I'll close the applicant's presentation and I'll open it up to public hearing. Is there anybody here to speak in favor of or against in the audience? If you could raise your hand. Yep. I'll take you one at a time if that's okay, and have you come to the podium and press the red button so that the mic is on, and introduce yourself and provide your address.
Hi, I'm Shanna Ballot. I'm at 3811 Trimble Road. 2 years ago, my husband and I stood before all of you in this room for our own variance hearing for the same land that adjoins the applicant's backyard. Our architect had shot down any idea that disturbed the buffer. He said that you would reject even the smallest ask because of the need to protect the floodplain. So we crossed off ideas for anything besides plants across the creek. Ultimately, we asked you if we could add a few feet of impermeable space on our patio. We offset this tiny request through an extensive planting plan of native greenery across the creek. Before our hearing, we sent personal letters to every neighbor within a wide radius to allay any concerns. The applicant was one of the neighbors who received our letter 2 years ago, as well as the official stormwater letter of our hearing. It all just adds to the paper trail that Stormwater has already noted, which belies the applicant's alleged hardship for not knowing the rules. The day of our hearing, our case was the only one that you approved. Many of you thanked us for our thoughtful petition. So imagine our dismay to see the very different approach by our neighbor regarding the very same land. We're saddened by the applicant's extravagant, unpermitted construction with mature trees chopped down in the buffer and plumbing, electrical, hardscaping, and turfing taking its place. It all negates the planting mitigation plan that you thanked us for. We've lost some of the beautiful protection that safeguards our serene forest-like backyard while still being constrained from making that backyard more usable to us personally. Our objections are not personal. The applicant may be a great guy in other contexts. That's irrelevant. The bottom line is that he made seismic changes without consideration for his neighbors or the common sense process that the rest of us abide by. We're all literally on the same playing field, although the neighbors don't have putting greens, pavilions with TVs and grills, and sports courts on our portions of the field. If the game is being changed for the applicant, then it should be changed for us all. My family might be the first in line to come back with a bigger ask than the one we had 2 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? Yes, please.
Is this on or? Oh, it is on. Okay. My name is Steve Ray. I am at 3809 Trimble Road. If you're looking at the picture up there, you can see I've got a little pool right there. And I'm going to you all have a copy of this, so I'm going to vary for just a second. At 4409 Estes, okay, that property is kind of the headwater of what's going into what we might call Trimble Valley here. In the 2010 flooding, the folks that lived there told me that the water did not get into their house. It came right up to their back door, and then it went away. This world is different. I first bumped into the folks at Stormwater because all along Harding, they've taken these single lots and they've built these monster homes, and now I have a better understanding of what it is you guys are able to look at and what this permeability stuff is all about. But what also I'm concerned about is the fact that if the water doesn't flow, it backs up. And my thinking is if this 2010 flood came now, 4409 would have water coming in her back door. The video that you all have seen that I took of the 2010 flooding from my little pool deck there, which is a little concrete deck. By the way, this house, we bought it from the guy that used to run the water department. The power of that water flowing through there was absolutely astounding. And the water was lapping over those little rock walls that you see there. If that water comes up any further, it's not unlikely those old walls will be undermined and give way. My lovely little pool there, which would never be permitted now, I understand that. It's a vinyl liner pool. All of that water is in there, 25,000 gallons, pressing, being held by that soil. If that wall goes, my whole pool is going to blow out the side, and then the water that would be flooding is going to be within what, 6-8 feet of my house? So any obstruction that is going to back the water up, especially one that we now know, forgiveness to me is not necessarily an option, because who's going to pay for that down the road? And it's unfortunate that had somebody gone into this up front, and I understand there's a little difference between how codes and stormwater communicates, but if that had been addressed up front, there might have been a solution that would have made everybody happy. Anyway, you have these remarks, and thank you guys for so much for looking into this, and I hope we can come up with something that works for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ray. Is anybody else? Yes, please come on up to the microphone.
I'm Justin Van Dam. I live at 3407 Springbrook Drive, which is not near this property, but concerned about the floodway as well. I would just ask this committee a question, which is, if the government is permitted to build sports fields that violate the flood regulations or would contribute to flooding, why can't a resident? That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Is anybody else here? Okay, great. I'll ask Logan I'll close public hearing and ask Logan if there's any letters in favor or opposition or anything from council.
Mr. Ray's letter has been sent to Rebecca, so we'll get that out to you. I got that this morning. I don't know if you've reviewed that specific letter, but there were also multiple letters sent from the last meeting, and also at the last meeting, Councilmember Ewing spoke as well. She didn't write anything new from that meeting, so. Everybody was in opposition within the letters, though.
Okay.
And I believe there was somebody here in favor that spoke the last meeting as well, so.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll move into deliberation amongst the commission now. Sorry? After, yes, after I can do it now? Okay, yes, if you'd like to do it now, you're welcome to, or afterwards, whichever. Up to you.
I'll go ahead and get it off my mouth.
Well, it's fresh,
my
sure.
chest now. Yes, we hear the neighbors' comments. I think we all share a common goal of not wanting all of our properties to flood. I think my client would also say, I don't want my property to flood either. And I also want to point out that there was some talk earlier about uncompensated fill. I don't think that's able to be proved that it is or it isn't, unfortunately, because we don't have an existing survey. When I walk it, eyeballing it, maybe a little bit, the turf is up. But whenever you look at this house, what I wanted to point out is that it splits around the house to the north. And so the area where the pavers and the structure is high, a little higher than what's across the creek. The turf area is higher than what's across the creek, and you can clearly see where the floodway splits and goes around to the north a little bit. And so for the concerned neighbors about any additional flooding, as best we can tell in observing this, the items that have been put out there are in areas that are higher than where the water would likely go if it were to flood again. And so I don't see, again, we don't have an existing survey, but from observation, it doesn't appear that water would get up into where this structure is. It would probably go around the north side of the house before it got there. So just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Commissioners. The one question I would like to ask to start off is recapping how we arrived here. I think it's important to identify the premise in which this case came before us. Logan, I'll ask you to correct me if I'm wrong. The applicant had arranged for a meeting with Metro Water Services to review proposed pool development. And in that request, there was a site meeting that was held in which the Metro Water Services representative detected all of these other issues that we've been discussing as part of this case. And so that is the moment in which the violation was issued, and so I wanted to make sure that if there was any other components to this outside of that we need to be aware of as part of the foundation of this case.
So, within the last meeting, we talked about an original variance too, back in 2006.
Let's talk about that.
Okay. So there was the house was built in 2005, and the owner and the builder, I guess, at that time, he probably was a builder who owned the property. He built a bridge across the creek, and he also did built the walls along the creek at that time without any kind of approval from Metro Water. He had state permits, but he didn't have our approval. And so we wrote him a notice of violation at that time. He came before the Stormwater Management Committee in 2006 and got approval for the walls along the creek, the bridge, and then I think he had possibly elevated the property a little bit at that time. There was no mapped floodplain or floodway at that time. It wasn't mapped in until 2017. It was just a buffer issue. And then, so like you're saying, the pool contractor that Mr. Padgett hired came into the office and asked if he could build a pool. So he said we'd meet out there. I had already worked with Jason on some other projects, some other properties that he was looking at for his business. And so we knew each other. And so myself and Phil Sad, who's an inspector, went out there and met with him. We did not discuss the structure. I took some pictures on that day, but we were primarily focused on the pool. And so we wrote the violation and sent it to Mr. Padgett. I think the violation was written on August 31st, 2023. And then he also, by right through the notice of violation process, you're able to appeal to staff if you feel like the violation is not, I guess, you're able to appeal to the director, his designee, basically to make sure that the violation was appropriate. And so he did that himself, Mr. Bill Herbert, Tom Palco, Tony Newmeyer, Kimberly Hayes, myself, and Michael Hunt, and Ms. Tara Ladd were present, and we had that meeting on September 19th, 2023. And so I've got a letter kind of outlining what we determined, and basically that was, we don't feel like we as staff can make this determination, so you need to go to the variance board. I think that's basically the history before they got here.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that.
So when I'm looking at this, we've got flooding concerns and we've got a structure in the buffer. The flooding concerns, from what I'm looking at, with the outlet pipe that they're putting in, it provides detention. With the dry wells, it provides detention. The flooding concerns, I don't think that this is making anything worse from that regard. I think it's making it better. The infiltration rates that they've got are pretty strong. They tested where they could. The regulation, the buffer disturbance is the item that would be more pertinent than the flooding. And I'm not diminishing the flooding concerns. They are a concern, but I don't think that this made it worse. And so looking at the structure, I can understand just looking up and down the creek why they thought it would be okay. Doesn't mean that that everybody should approach it that way. I appreciate the offset, with the, putting 3 different dry wells on it, turning the turf into detention. But the question that I had is, if you lived there in 2010, do you recall water getting out of the banks or up? I mean, I looked at aerial photos and the structure next door was there during 2010. It's obviously still there. I don't know if it got out of the banks. It obviously didn't wash that structure away. So.
Yeah, I mean, again, the flooding, like you just said, the flooding situation from my property itself is improving and has been before we even do what we're proposing to do. The drainage on my property, because where that turf is, it used to be like, in a heavy rain, it would be a swamp out there. It's now better, and it's not because it runs it off to the neighbors. It contains it, and I wish y'all could see snapshots of then and now, but it's already better on my property. And it's not impacting, it's improving.
Have you seen the water get out of the banks?
In 2010, it did come over the banks on my house side. But it wasn't coming through the backside of my yard. It was on that other side. It really wasn't a concern, as you can probably tell by the map. It wasn't a main concern on my property as much as it was down to the left as I look at that. But outside of 2010, it's never ever come out. I mean, these walls are 6 feet, 7 feet, maybe a little bit taller than that. The walls on the creek and my property are much higher than most that I can see on either side of my property. So it is contained even better than most, and I haven't changed that at all. Those walls are still there. I haven't changed what that.
Yeah, with how the walls stick up and the fact that it is a concrete line, or brick line channel, the water just sits until it infiltrates, and it goes that way with the turf, or if it were grass. It doesn't provide the natural overflow treatment that a buffer would, just because it does. I mean, from the pictures you can tell it has a little wedge.
I see this.
Definitely unique.
Oh, sorry, didn't mean to
No,
interrupt
go
you.
Rambling.
No, thinking back the last time we heard this case, as I was trying to compartmentalize the issues, to me, the 2 issues, we have the structure and the floodway. And I think that there is an interpretation of Metro Code that there's a claim that there is some ambiguity. It's ambiguous. There we go. I can talk this morning. Which is the only reason I think this is before us today. Otherwise, that couldn't even come before us to be making the request to have any structure within the floodway. So I've been thinking about that over the last couple of days, and I do think there could be some clarity in the code in the future as it relates to public versus, residential use. We did get some additional input from the original council members who submitted it, and they, I think, clarified their intent was for public use. As we sit here today, I think there could be maybe a determination from this commission that this shouldn't be before us and it has to be removed. It is before us. So I do think that this commission should go back and potentially make some recommendations to make the intent more clear to the public as to what that exception is for this. I think the only reason we are here is because there is a claim that this structure is for like a dugout purpose or something that would be used at maybe a ballpark. I don't see that here. However, I am okay moving forward, making a determination on this, and I think I've been very clear that there should not be structures in the floodway. That is kind of, as a commissioner, that's the way that I see it, and that's the way that I read the regulations. I don't think that this particular exception, which is why it's before us, is very persuasive in the way that it's been brought to us. I don't see this as a dugout structure or something that is utilized as a part of, a playing field. So that's how I've been looking at this from that. The second part is the turf. And I really appreciate the commission's background and how the infiltration works, because I will say I'm not an engineer, so I'm learning about that as well. But when I look at this, I am not here to punish anyone. I am looking at this as if this was a variance request being brought to us, as if the work had not been done. And that's the way that I'm looking at it. Other commissioners may look at it differently. My concern with the turf and looking at the tree coverage that was there before in the Zone 1 and Zone 2 buffers, if you brought this before this commission and said this is what we want to do, we would expect, to me at least, a higher mitigation plan as it relates to tree planting. And I am not, there's really no space for that with what the request that's being brought for us today. So I wanted to share my initial thoughts and where my head's at, and I'd love to hear more of the discussion, but I've kind of carved these out into two different ways that I'm looking at it, the structure and then the turf. Don't know if that's helpful for anyone else.
I've got a question for legal. Single-family residential is not required to pull tree clearing permits. But you would have, I'm trying to figure out the regulation. You're not supposed to clear trees out of a buffer, but if you call no landscape company knows any different. I'm trying to figure out how we can educate in the future, because only commercial properties are required to pull tree clearing permits. So can you cut a tree down that's in the buffer? Does that come before the board?
Is there a specific stormwater regulation that you guys are aware of with the removal? I would have to start looking as you guys continue your deliberations. It's not something that I can tick right off.
I think predominantly, unless Rebecca has additional clarification, that, typically the floodway and the buffers, especially Zone 1 buffer, is considered a no disturb zone. You're just not supposed to do stuff in that area. And so I want to talk relative to the Metro Code requirement, 15.64.170, was written after the 2010 flood. And it starts out, the intent of that, Section A says, no new structure shall be built in the floodway, period. So it was in months following that where there were council members that were concerned that, well, but sometimes a floodway is a big wide expanse, and why can't we put a flat parking lot in there? And ultimately it led us to Section F that said, because we had a property owner come in and said, there's an enormous wide swath of floodway in Mill Creek, where Antioch Pike, after the bridge over the creek and you go north on Antioch Pike, there were some abandoned Little League baseball fields. And the guy says, this neighborhood needs soccer fields. We've got a lot of people that are soccer players. There are a lot of Hispanic residents in that neighborhood. They all want to play soccer. Let us convert these Little League parks into a soccer field. And it was in our discussion with them that said, okay, if you're going to build soccer fields and they're going to be tournaments all day Saturday, you need probably some concession stands and some restrooms and a maintenance shed or whatever. And that's what led us to write that clause, was because of that very specific need. Every one of those exceptions came out of a very specific need to do something in a floodway that otherwise had a strict prohibition against doing anything new in a floodway. So that's kind of the way that came about. But the important component of that is that a number of members of the city council said, why are we rehabbing houses in the floodway? We shouldn't be building anything in the floodway to start with. And that's what led us to that whole new section. But I want to also caution you about this discussion about my house didn't flood in 2010, so I am good to go. Because I have administered multiple additional events since 2010. In 2011, there was flooding in Ewing Creek. In 2013, we had multiple houses flooded in Gibson Creek. In Whites Creek Basin, what we call the remnants of Harvey storm, flooded parts of Whites Creek that never flooded in 2010. There have been 2 events in Mill Creek in the last 4 years that have flooded properties, most recently 2 years ago. And these are Mill Creek did flood significantly in 2010. But 2 years ago, we had 200 houses flood in a flood of record on 7 Mile Creek in the Mill Creek Basin. All houses that mostly likely didn't flood in 2010. So I caution people all the time that 2010 is not a standard by which all other floods are measured. It was a freak event. People say, well, it was a 1,000-year event. Well, it was in the Harpeth River Basin, but it was a 500-year event in Mill Creek, and it was a 200-year event in Richland Creek. And depending on where you were around the city, dictated how much rain fell on you relative to the basin next door or 2 basins over. So let's don't compare anything to the 2010 flood, because every freak event is unique and different. And again, I lean back to the reason for writing 170 to start with. Let's don't build anything in the floodway. So that's kind of a point of clarification, I guess. And if anybody has any questions,
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I really appreciate the history and the context. Mr. Lewis.
Yeah, my question's more logistical. If you go buy a piece of property and it's in a floodway and it has a stream running through it and there's a stream buffer, who notifies you that you're not able to mow that? Are there any deed restrictions that come when you go to the closing table that are conveyed to you? There's nothing. And just to say, well, you should have known. Well, I think we have to come up with a legal process that attaches to the property whenever floodways, it's kind of like an easement. But, if we approve these structures, we have to look, did we increase the risk of flooding in this tributary? And I think that's a yes or no question. To go further than that, the results of either ruling are going to set a precedent that I don't think people are ready to see. If people aren't supposed to mow up to in a stream buffer, right up and down a bunch of streets in Nashville, I rode by one today and saw a guy with a weed eater and just kind of laughed and said, if you only knew. And, I don't think there's enough enforcement people in Metro to go after the violations of people that are mowing in stream beds alone. Mowing in stream buffers. So, and if we do approve it, then like the owners down the street said, they may come back with some asks. I think that would be fair with some asks, as long as it doesn't increase the likelihood of flooding on the area. But it's just it's a terrible situation. There's really not a right answer in this ruling as far as the common sense moving forward. But we do have to think very carefully, because precedents are being established both ways, and I'd rather have the precedent on that street than all over Davidson County.
Well, something last month, wasn't the addition to the house, didn't that trigger buffers that otherwise the buffers weren't there until the application was made? So that's another just odd situation, parcel by parcel. If anybody's ever filed for a permit, they might have buffers, but they might not.
Right, but where's the checklist? When you buy the property, you can, you cannot. I mean,
yeah, and that's the way it works. Because if you've lived in your house for 20 years and you've always mowed down to the creek bank, if you haven't ever done any repair of flood damage or the addition of new features on your home, an expansion or remodeling, anything that would trigger substantial improvement or substantial damage, if you're doing any work that's more than 50% of the value of the structure, then that kicks in, that 50% level. Once you exceed that level, anytime you do something significant to a property, it kicks in the buffers. So John Smith can mow down to the top of the bank because there's never been a buffer that's been triggered because he's never done work there. But if his next door neighbor builds a big new kitchen and den on the house and it's substantial improvement, That triggers the buffers, and now we've got the kinds of things that you consider on a regular basis here, where somebody comes in and says, one of their requests is, I want to be able to mow and maintain the buffer to a certain point down the yard or whatever, because now he has buffers that are in play. The question of the purchase of a property and what constitutes due diligence, every parcel in the floodplain in Nashville, and that's floodplain plus floodway, every parcel has been flagged at codes. So that if you come in and you want to pull a permit to build a new house, if you're in the floodplain, that triggers you to have to clear the requirements that are defined by the Stormwater Manual. Not everybody sees those, not everybody knows those. There are parcels in Nashville that are fully within the floodway of various creeks. Many of those we just consider simply to be unbuildable lots. And yet still, we get people walking the door and say, I just paid $1 million for this lot. And we're like, wow, what constitutes due diligence? Because you've essentially paid a lot of money for a parcel that doesn't have the ability to have permits approved for it. So those are challenges. I spoke with a lawyer a month ago from New York who wanted to file a lawsuit because he had a contract to buy a parcel and he's accusing the owner of not revealing that it was in the floodplain. And any one of us or any lawyer in New York can spend 3 minutes on our parcel viewer and establish whether or not a parcel is in the floodplain or floodway or buffer. All of those things are very, very easy to find in a matter of minutes. So the question of, why don't all realtors warn their that's in the floodplain. I do presentations for real estate brokerage offices. I teach them how to open Parcel Viewer and find those buffer lines and find the floodplains. It's not hard to do, and unfortunately, it's not always done.
So if that's the case, I'm just playing devil's advocate. If it was mapped as a floodway in 2017, no permit's been pulled since 2017, this is not a 25% value of the house, it's an independent structure, so I don't know if you compare it against a $0 value or the value of the house. Technically, are there floodway buffers on this, or would it just be stream buffers as there have been for the last 20 years, which are being violated up and down the stream by those driveways, those permits? The one a couple of doors down was built in 2016. I mean, that was right before the floodway mapping, but that's a major driveway and a stream buffer. And so what is the metric that?
Can I just right the ship here a little bit? I always love when you guys deliberate, but I want to make sure that we're hitting the right points and we're looking at this the right way. You are looking at this case before you. You're not looking at the cases that are what's been done to the neighboring properties around you. I understand that that's an argument that they want to make, but that's not relevant to this case. Did he violate the regulations? And it's not just, does it increase the floodway or does it increase the flooding that you reference? You have to go back to your regs. You have to go back to when can you grant a variance? And it's very specific parameters on when you can grant a variance. And so I want to read that to you because I want you to look at it through that lens. And I understand the position of, everyone else is doing it, why can't I? But your role here is you hear the facts and you apply it to the regulations that have been created for you. So I'm just going to go over this once, and then you guys can go back to your deliberations and I will step away. All right, so a variance can only be issued upon a determination that the variance is the minimum necessary, considering the flooding hazard to afford relief, and in the instance of historic building, not relevant, a determination that the variance is the minimum necessary so as not to destroy the historic character. All right, Section B is the point here. Variances shall only be issued upon 1, a showing of good and sufficient cause, 2, a determination that failure to grant the variance would result in exceptional hardship, And 3, a determination that the granting of a variance would not result in increased flood hazards, additional threats to public safety, or extraordinary public expense, create nuisance, cause fraud, or victimization of the public, or conflict with existing laws or ordinances. So you have a very specific set of rules that you're supposed to be looking at. And then the question then becomes, well, what is exceptional hardship? Is exceptional hardship, I didn't know the rules? Is exceptional hardship that I knew the rules, but I didn't know all of the rules? It's not. It's very specific and it's very detailed, and we found that, I've shared that case with you guys in the past as well. All right, and the hardship is an exception. The hardship is one that would result from failure to grant the variance, must be exceptional, unusual, and specific to the property involved, not the personal circumstances of the applicant. And when determining whether an applicant has established an exceptional hardship sufficient to justify a variance, the local variance appeal board or other governing body must weigh the applicant's hardships against the community-wide flood damage prevention requirements. Is Mr. Pageant's property different from the neighbor's property? It's not. He has the same property. He's in the same position as all the other properties along this creek. So riding the ship a little bit, that is the lens that you should really be looking at this case through. If you have any further questions, let me know.
So is this a floodway buffer or a stream buffer based on the enactment of the regulations? Because I think it's relevant comparing it to which buffer.
This creek has mapped floodway and buffers on it. And it is a regular process of ours to continue to upgrade maps. There was a long gap between 2001, a long time ago, when those maps were created. 2017 was the first major update of those maps, and it was done in 2017. We were already in the process of updating maps when the flood occurred in 2010. And we asked the Corps of Engineers, who was doing our modeling, to back up, go back, consider the extent of the flood and the damage, the amount of rain that fell, the amount of flow in the rivers and creeks, and to come back ultimately in an updated set. We updated all 164 map panels in the Metro Nashville area in 2017. There were many creeks that were picked up, like this creek, that had not been modeled or mapped 16 years earlier. This past 2022, we reissued 60 new map panels that have been updated and upgraded based on new LIDAR, based on new flow data. And so we did that in 2022. We had 60 new panels issued. And then in June of this year, we will release 18 new map panels. And in almost every case, there are multiple new tributaries to other creeks or tributaries to the Cumberland River that have been modeled now and are mapped and will take effect when this next new phase is released. We have the ability to model and map a lot faster than we did 20 years ago, but it's part of our regular process because there are many tributaries or many small creeks that had not been modeled and mapped before. This one was modeled and mapped in 2017, but it also goes to our procedure with FEMA approval that once we get preliminary maps, and we've got preliminary maps that then become pending maps, we begin to enforce to those maps, even though the new maps may not take effect for 2 or 3 years, because I don't want somebody to build a big new house knowing we're already looking at preliminary maps and we already see what floodways and what the base flood elevations are. I don't want somebody building $1 million new house when I'm sitting on a set of preliminary maps that are already pretty evident what the ultimate case will be, and have an owner argue, well, but the maps aren't effective, so I want to build by an old standard. Well, we want you to build by a new standard. So the 2017 maps should be effective maps that were in play when certainly when this work was done, those were mapped floodways and floodway buffers and so on.
I will say, I think our counselor did a good job getting us back to what we have to focus on. I keep our stormwater management manual that we have limited ability as a commission, and this outlines how we are supposed to make our rulings. I think the exceptional hardship is something that we have to look at in this instance, and I would be looking at exceptional hardship whether the work had been done or not, but my understanding, their claim for exceptional hardship here is the cost of removing the work and then remediating the property to comply with codes. To me, that is not an exceptional hardship. I believe our counselor is reading from our Precision Homes Inc. versus Metropolitan government case, which is a 2019 Court of Appeals case, that did give us a little bit more guidance as to what an exceptional hardship would be. I also keep this case with me, have it highlighted, because that is important for us as a commission to make that determination. And here, I am not seeing the exceptional hardship in light of the properties. And to the point that we were discussing, we are limited to look at what is before us. What is happening on the properties, those could have been built prior to it being in a floodway. They could have come to this committee at some other point and gotten a variance. I'm not aware of that. So what I am looking at is what the case that's been brought in front of us. We, as a commission too, are not the enforcement arm. So I feel like I can't speak to necessarily enforcement, but what I can speak to is the case that's been brought before us.
I think in looking at the 5 variance requests that are before us, I believe they're similar, maybe an additional one that's been added based on the plan before us. But I think we're looking at these 4. I think we had discussion last time as well that said there needs to be proper mitigation if there's a request for a variance. The unpermitted structure, I think we've talked about. I agree with the discussion that it's an item that I kind of look at specifically. And then if we look at disturbances of the floodway buffer and the continuous mowing and maintenance, I think we, if I remember correctly, and we'd have to review the video, but requested the mitigation for that request be included in the package that was brought back before us. I don't believe that has been done. To say that the disturbances to put the turf in, the infiltration rates may be adequate, but if that was something that was before us to say we are seeking a variance for it, here's our mitigation for this variance request because of this hardship, then you'd be able to evaluate that request in full, as opposed to saying, here's our request. I don't think the mitigation is necessarily clear, and I don't know that the hardship is really clear in this case either. I guess, satisfy what we asked for, I think, when it comes back.
I think to both of your points, I think we can start to pull this together. I love your approach, Mr. Oliver, of let's go component by component. And before we do that, I do have one question for legal to bring you back in. Ms. Tara, we established that for residential practices, a tree removal permit is not required. Is that true or false?
I think it would depend on the context you're asking. If you're asking is a tree removal, like a single tree in a yard that has no other context, I mean, there's no, right? Like if my property was not encumbered at all, could I remove a tree on my property? The answer is yes. As Roger stated, if you have trees and buffers, then the stormwater regulations would kick in, and that's different than an individual property owner who just has a tree in their backyard.
Yeah. Okay. Then I have a second question. Let's separate the structure in the floodway from the turf and look at those two individually. Can you confirm whether or not that structure would have required a permit?
I want to defer to staff on enforcement, but I feel confident that it would have. Logan?
Yeah, I've had conversations with the zoning examiner that the structure itself would have required a permit.
Okay.
Not the turf.
So then, okay, so structure would have required a permit, that would have gone to review, would have been flagged. The turf, moving to the turf, is it true or false that the turf would not have required a permit?
Not a building permit.
or any sort of review by Metro that would have flagged it being within the buffer?
It would have required a variance.
But would they have to have submitted a site plan
Yes.
to Metro?
Yeah, for a variance from the stormwater regulations.
I think there's different things, right? Like, is there anything required of Metro? Do you have to go get a building permit is different from saying, do you need a variance if you're building in the floodway? So you're sort of,
Correct. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where I'm trying to have a deep understanding of how would the applicant have known?
I mean, at a minimum, in 2006, there was a variance. They established a 25-foot buffer at that time. So there was at least a 25-foot buffer at that time that would have been in effect on the property. And that's just from the stream. So you would,
When the floodway was mapped in 2017 and the buffers, would the properties that would have been impacted by that mapping been notified of that mapping?
I can speak, Roger can speak to that too.
Right,
sure.
and that's a great question, because we are by an ordinance that says that anytime you map someone into the floodplain, you have to notify them. And so I'm in the process right now of preparing a mail out for the 18 new map panels that will take effect in June, to notify everybody that's in those parcels, if there's every structure that's along the floodway and floodplain of those newly mapped and newly modeled and newly mapped streams will get a notification letter from us saying, we've upgraded the maps and your parcel is in the mapped floodplain. Be aware that you may get correspondence from your mortgage company saying, now you're required to carry flood insurance on your parcel. Any number of different kinds of impacts that there may be associated with now being mapped into the floodplain. And I always clarify, you're not being mapped into the floodplain. The maps now identify your structure as being in the floodplain. Okay. If you've got a creek in your backyard, you're likely in the floodway or floodplain. And so it's just, now there's kind of this official document that establishes in more detail what that requirement is.
Yeah, and that's kind of what your handout here is. The printed is the mail out that we send out. We've sent that out 4 or 5 years to this specific property and about 12,000 other properties.
We sent 14,800 of them out last year. So
Certified, or are they?
No, we don't certify them. We get some back. We don't go back and compare one to the other. Some come back because they're mailed to like a condo association or something like that, but it's one of the requirements that we meet for our CRS community rating system. To notify people in floodplains, hey, your house is in a floodplain, whether you knew it or not, and there's all these details, including these are all things that are required by FEMA and the ISO, the CRS. That there's a whole section here about how to build responsibly. And it goes into, one, you need a grading permit. You need, building permits issued by codes. It just kind of summarizes all the requirements that you have because you own a structure in the floodplain. So we send this out, and I put my personal phone number on here, saying if you have any questions or you want to gripe or complain about it, please call Roger Lindsay. So it doesn't list me by name, but I got all of a dozen calls last year out of the 14,800 of these that I sent out. So I don't care whether they call me or not.
Well, only a dozen?
Huh?
You only got a dozen?
Yeah.
That makes me think that everybody thinks it's spam and just pitches it.
Well, it could be, but we our target is to get them out every year. This year we'll do a double mailing because we got this, the 14,000 that are on the spreadsheet plus, and I don't have a full number yet, but the 18 map panels that are being updated, every new segment that wasn't previously modeled and mapped will get a letter as well, explaining, that there are different obligations and responsibilities associated with this.
Okay. All right, I want to try to work towards a motion here. Thank you for that, Mr. Lindsay. Go ahead.
As we're breaking this down,
Yeah.
the mitigation that's shown on the plans, I would think that the dry wells were to mitigate the rooftop versus turf, or is that I think that's kind of pertinent to what we're talking.
It is, and that's where I want to try to lay out the facts and what was required by the applicant, and where we are now in these individual components. So the structure would have had to have been permitted. The turf, I still have some difference in opinion between legal and staff, I feel. No? Okay, could you help me clarify that?
You wouldn't have to go to codes to pull a building permit for turf, but you would have triggered a variance.
Be here in front of us.
To be in front of
requesting
you guys
that
and to
variance.
start with stormwater. That's two different things. With the shed, you would do both. You would probably, maybe he would have gotten he would have gotten picked up at codes, but technically the shed, he would have required a variance too. But to your point, he would be triggered if he went for the shed by codes. I think that's where you're going.
Well, but also everybody's mowing the buffer, so technically they would have to come to the committee to disturb the buffer in a way as well. Is that?
I
help me
agree,
here,
but
Rebecca,
again,
also.
I don't see us as an enforcement arm. So people have to come and follow the code, and if they are doing something that would be in violation of the code, they are supposed to ask for a variance. And that is what we are here to make a determination on the variance request that's coming before us. So, maybe it's because of my background, but because someone else did something wrong doesn't mean, that I have to follow the rules. That's not a compelling argument to me. I do understand that, we are serving the people of Nashville. There might be, so I understand the perspective that you're coming at. I may see it a little bit different.
And so to come out of this case where I hope we can land is to not find ourselves in this situation again. So that's why I'm bringing up all these pieces, so that to Commissioner Lewis's point earlier, there was nothing in the deed that identified these restrictions that maybe should be a part of that language. And I don't want to add to more work to staff or the process.
I mean, I will tell you, whenever I purchased my property, and I might be a rare individual, I pulled the FEMA flood maps. I know I have lived in Nashville for a long time. I was familiar with the 2010 flood. I pulled the Metro maps as well to determine where the flood zone was. These are all publicly available, pieces of information that anyone can access.
So, and I was just going to say a few things too. What you're talking about with the mowing and maintenance, the property owner who spoke earlier, that's a neighbor that came before the commission, that was one of the issues. They had a 30-foot buffer. They didn't know it was there, so they continued to mow. And so they came and got approval to continue to mow their buffer back 2 years ago.
They got triggered when they asked for an addition.
Well, they were just mowing it. They had built, it was built after that buffer came into place, and either they weren't the ones that owned it and were never notified that it was there, or it was just ignored. I can't remember honestly.
And that's the piece. Ms. Down, you have something to add? Sorry.
And I believe the neighbor did mention that she also sent out a letter discussing this to her neighbors as well, which would have informed. And I think I believe the plans were put in your packet of a property that, I don't know if it ever was built, but that the applicant had been made aware of buffers upon through the development process and meeting with Logan. So I don't think buffers would have been a surprise at that point.
I can speak to the notification process too. It used to be that when Ms. Paula was the person, she would basically write the signs by hand, and then they just put them on the property, and so anybody driving by could see the signs. I think in 2020, maybe 2020, 2021, council passed an ordinance that required us to be very similar to Planning Commission or PCA, where you have to send out neighbor notifications within 1,000 feet of your property. So with each variance case, we prepare the sign information. The applicant prints the signs and puts them out at their property. And they also send a letter that specifically says what the variance request is for to every neighbor within 1,000 feet. I personally prepared that list. It could be 200 properties within 1,000 feet sometimes.
And I will say, I am ready to put forward a motion, but I don't want to rush the rest of the commission. And I think this is all good conversation. But I am prepared to put forward a motion, but before I do so, I want to make sure that the commission has the opportunity to further discuss if they feel it's necessary. Or there can always be discussion after, if my motion gets a second.
And so, just one more thing. We also have a very detailed analysis of 1564-170 from the original councilperson. Information about what was said in council meetings, you know, what the sponsor for the legislation, what his purpose for it was. There was one council member who presented 1564-170, just the no structures part, and then, you know, a different council person added section F, and kind of what his discussion with different community organizations was, and what his presentation to council was, and them ultimately accepting that back in 2011, 2012 timeframe. So be happy to share that as well, but it's extremely detailed.
See, that was part of the summary you provided.
Okay, is there any other, does the applicant have something to?
Yeah, the question is, I want to respect the process. Am I allowed to ask questions?
Legal? Okay,
Sorry, no.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, if we can ask you for comment, but not questions of the commission at this point.
okay. All right. Any other discussion?
I think just quickly, just to point to the discussion about the previous regulation, I think that's fine to have as knowledge. I think in that process, it's something that would be a part of the variance request. It would be evaluated of where that structure is going and what the impact of that structure would be and how it is allowed according to whatever the regulations are. And to me, that doesn't have much application here because we're not doing that. And so I think it's good context and background, but I don't really think it necessarily affects what the request is before us today.
Well, I move to deny the variance request that's been presented to us.
Okay, we have a motion. Do we have a second? Okay. Seeing none. Yeah. Just like to, legal, I need your help on the Roberts rules here where there's not a
Her
second.
motion,
The person has to
that's fine.
rescind.
Her motion's failed because there wasn't a second, and so you're back to the drawing board.
Okay, so motion's failed, and we're back to the drawing board. Back to discussion. Okay. I'll entertain any other ideas.
I think that it's easy to, you were talking about breaking it into two, the easiest thing. Speaking to the turf first, I'd say make a motion to approve the turf to remain. I say there's no negative impact of that.
Okay, we'll take these one by one. Is that okay, legal for this case, to take the
Yeah, you can take it one by one,
individually?
just make sure that you're clear in each step, and then make sure that everything is addressed.
I do have a question related to.
Should we get a
that.
second first and then discussion?
Yeah,
Or
that's what I was kind of, okay.
Okay, so we have a motion to allow the turf to remain. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
There's been a second. Any discussion?
Related to the turf, I kind of go back to the requirement for mitigation of that, and I don't really feel like that mitigation has been put forth for that. I'm not, I agree that I think the infiltration provides the verification that it's not impacting the ability for the water to move, but the impact to the buffer, I think, still needs to be mitigated. And can we put a condition on that has to be provided in some way, or does that need to come back through to say that, yes, you can disturb the buffer? I guess procedurally, how can that be added to this?
I don't think we can design something for them or dictate. We have to approve what's submitted, is my understanding.
Legal cannot, okay, yes.
Yeah, thank you. And that's kind of what I wanted to touch upon earlier. You asked about mitigation. To help clarify what we did submit, we have, I'll call it 5 points of mitigation. We are talking about turf and structure, okay? In the turf component, we're providing a form of mitigation of detention. So if you were to see this on any other case, what you might see is underground detention, you might see a biopond, you might see something like that that captures water and infiltrates it into the ground. That's essentially the same thing that we're proposing for this mitigation. In this case, the system, the structure is already in place because there's pipes under the ground with gravel. And if we were to take that pipe and upturn it, it effectively puts an outlet control structure on it. And so we've essentially created a large detention basin for the turf. So that's one of the mitigation practices for the turf. There has also been a landscape plan submitted that would have additional plantings that also help provide buffer mitigation, because I know in the past, enhancing the buffer is something that we care about, and that is also a component of the mitigation. Now that's for the turf. For the impervious surface, to clarify, we have 3 dry wells proposed that will provide above and beyond mitigation than what anybody else would have up and down the creek, which is we're providing mitigation for the structure itself with a dry well that is sized to fully treat that particular structure. And in addition to that, we're going back and retroactively treating the existing house, the southern half of the house, which is above and beyond what would already be required out there. So I hope that helps clarify the mitigations and how they are in line with the impacts.
If I may, I have a couple questions.
Yep.
What is the bottom layer, what is the cross-section of the turf? What is the bottom layer composed of?
Gravel.
There's no fabric underneath it, it's just gravel and then the top?
Yeah, I believe it was scraped and then gravel put down. And I have the handout of the stuff that was used. I think it was submitted, but I can hand that to you,
Okay,
Rebecca.
and then are the dry wells, it looks like 2 of the 3 of them are being placed in the floodplain? Is it this one,
Yeah,
those 3?
those 4 circles, and we're placing them in locations that are going to capture the water, which would be, I guess you could argue it's up against the edge of the floodplain on the structure on the south. And then on the house, there would be one on the right rear and one on the left rear.
So it looks like this one may be out of the floodplain, but these 2 would be in the floodplain.
That's correct.
And I do mention that because we do not believe in infiltrative practices in the floodplain as being very effective.
Yeah, I don't know how else we can treat it. It's on the downstream side of the house.
Not being.
And just for clarification to Nathan's question, the landscape plan wasn't changed from the last submittal. Like, we didn't get a new landscape plan within this package. There was one from the January meeting, but nothing on that changed.
That is correct. There's nothing changed, therefore we didn't change anything on it.
Okay, we have a motion, a component of this case, we have a motion to approve the turf as it's installed with the mitigation as been described and proposed. And that has been properly seconded. Is there any other discussion?
So to summarize, the mitigation for the turf and the disturbance of the buffer would be the 2 dry wells that capture some portion of the house.
I thought those were related to the rooftop.
Yeah, it's the detention that's being formed by the turned up.
Essentially, they're adding a bunch of volume to the floodplain by adding the stone and putting the turn up and requiring that water to infiltrate rather than giving it an outlet. Because today, prior to the turf, the water would just sit there and pond.
Mm-hmm.
And so now it has stone to go into and floodplain volume that's not otherwise occupied, and then it gives it the ability to infiltrate and relieves it from the stream channel.
As well as the landscape plan previously submitted. Correct.
I don't think the landscape plan, I think there were more trees removed to do this work than what the landscape plan even presents, would just be my comment.
That landscape plan was, I don't recall, was that in this packet? I didn't see
No, it wasn't in the new packet. It's in the December packet. Rebecca may be able to pull it up.
Okay.
Or, well, February probably, maybe in the February. 12/13/2023 variance plan. I think that might be the October submittal, Rebecca.
Has the landscape plan changed since this one?
That one looks different than the one I'm
Okay.
looking at, just a little bit.
Let me try again.
Yeah, there was one from December.
And it shows, is that 3 trees, a dogwood and 2 river birches? And then shrubs.
Yeah, the trees proposed and the shrubs are filling up the areas that are around there. And the client has told me that there were very few trees removed that are actually in the buffer. Most of the trees removed are back from where the basketball court is, which is outside of the buffer. I don't know if that's relevant or not. But when you look at the canopy, a tree or two makes up a lot of the coverage when you look at the older aerials. But again, we don't have a survey or evidence of exactly the number. Thank you.
And I will say, my comment was just my view of the aerials, and it is difficult to make a determination, but that was my perception when I viewed the aerials.
Rebecca, can you bring up an aerial? I think we might have had a comparison aerial.
I might see 7, but it has significant canopy coverage. It's hard to identify exactly what the trees are. Like you can say, this is a tree, and this is a tree, and this is a tree, and this is a tree. So there were more trees there than proposed.
Okay, we have a motion that's been properly seconded. There's been some healthy discussion. Is there any more discussion? Okay, seeing none, I'll ask for a vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
I oppose.
One opposed?
I'm going to be unopposed.
Any abstained? Oh, sorry, two opposed? Any abstained? Okay, so that's a 2-3 vote, motion carries. Okay, so that's one component of this case.
So that would effectively be 2 through 5 of the variance asks? Or are you
Confirm.
just approving 2, I guess.
This was just for the turf.
So the 5 variants asked are allowance of the unpermitted structure to remain in the floodway, allowance of disturbances of the floodway buffer to remain, continuous mowing and maintenance of portions of the buffer, uncompensated fill in the floodplain, and allowance of green infrastructure practices within the floodway buffer.
I think the trouble with that is the shed covers all those, right? So,
But I think the last point, allowance of green infrastructure, like dry wells, would be tied to approval of the structure.
Yes, some are tied to both.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
And the turf also includes uncompensated fill, correct?
Yeah, I believe so.
Is there not an obligation to provide proof that there was uncompensated fill? How can we prove that when we walk out there whenever you can't
I
tell?
think that's why we're approving it, just because it doesn't seem like there was. And so it,
Did you place fill underneath the turf?
Wasn't there, don't have a survey. It was scraped and gravel was placed and then the turf. And that's what it looks like. I'm going based on visual observations that I can't tell from a professional standpoint if there was fill or not, because we don't have evidence of what it looked like 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
How deep is the cross-section of the gravel? Fits the pipes, right?
I'm sorry,
There's pipes in gravel,
but the gravel, I'm gonna say is 10 to 12 inches.
so that's probably fill in the floodplain.
But it was scraped prior to placement.
I can 100% verify that there was no dirt brought in. It was, what was scraped from where the basketball court is, was pushed towards the turf area. So it was just redistributed.
So you're saying they dug out 10 inches of fill to fill in with 10 inches of gravel? Because that would be a significant amount of dirt moving from the property.
No, there was no, my point is there was no dirt brought in. It's higher where the sport court is, and so that was pushed in. When we removed the trees where the sport court was, did we move some rock or whatever out? We did do that. So there was more that went out than came in. I don't know if I'm answering Bill's question.
The grade next to the wall on that side of the creek looks very similar to what it looked like in 2006. Standing to the side, like I've walked the properties to the side, just right there in the middle of the turf, it looks like maybe a foot, 2 feet higher than, it's higher than the neighbor's property at 3815 for sure. But I don't know what it was like before the turf was put in, honestly. And it does slope up to the basketball court.
okay. All right, so going back to answer your question about the components of the case and how they're interrelated with the components of the violations. The turf was interwoven into the second and third and fourth.
I would say so. If you're viewing the dry wells as the mitigation for the structure alone, then, and the plantings, I guess, would be the mitigation for the turf. If that's how you're viewing it, then you could separate out 2 and 5 as one request, and the other one. I know it gets a little tricky.
I have to turn to legal to make sure we get the second motion correct on whether or not we need to follow in line with the components of the variance.
I think it's 2 through 5 as they relate to the turf.
Is that acceptable?
I think you should clarify your motion, and when you're making that motion, you should probably go back and say what the turf remains, and therefore 2, 3, 4, and 5 are satisfied because of X, Y, and Z. So maybe you need to amend your motion to be more clear. of which numbers that it includes. I can't really help you because I don't know the technical details of which variance you're saying does include.
The trouble with this one is that both the structure and the turf are related to, 4 out of 5 of the components in the variance requests. So they're shared. So when we talk about the structure, it is also in a disturbance to the floodway buffer, just as the turf is.
But are we approving those points, or are we approving the turf which is tied to those points?
The turf as it relates to those points.
Right. And so if there's a motion put forth, if there's a motion put forth on the structure and it carries or doesn't, then it would also apply to whatever.
Yeah, I think it would be clean, like, for instance, if you vote that the structure needs to come down, then it would clean itself up that way, if it's encompassed in both. But I do think whoever, when you're making the motion, you need to look at the agenda very carefully and make sure that each of those are covered. By just saying the turf remains and then there's technical variances associated with that, I think you need to clear that up in your motion. I can't do that because I can't make your motion and I don't know which ones you're saying is included in the turf.
So,
Staying.
in the original notice of violation, the disturbances that were listed were the structure, artificial turf, impermeable paver patio, which is next to the structure, and then continued mowing and maintenance of the buffer. So, the 3 disturbances, when I was writing it, I was listing disturbances as the structure, artificial turf, and the impermeable paver patio.
Okay, I think we need to redo that, and so it's probably best to create a motion to rescind what was previously called. Is that acceptable to legal?
Or yeah, could you just clarify too? You don't have to, you can do a motion to, I thought Roger was talking. You can do a motion to amend. Yeah, you can do that.
Okay.
Do the list of 2 through 5.
Yeah.
I'll make a motion to amend the previous motion to clarify that the intent for the turf to remain, which approves previous disturbances of the floodway buffer, Bellmead Branch, disturbances to the buffer to implement the landscape plan as mitigation, allow continuous mowing and maintenance of the rear yard as the opposite side of the stream is going to be not required to be mowed. With both sides, that would be approved. Any consideration of uncompensated fill is satisfied, so approval of the uncompensated fill relative to the turf and allowance of the turf as a green infrastructure practice to remain within the floodway buffer.
And then do you have a second on the amended motion?
Yep, so first a second for the motion. That's been seconded. Okay, any other discussion on that? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Opposed.
2 opposed? Okay, 3, 4, 2 opposed, none abstained. Okay, so motion's carries. All right, so now we're back to the original motion as been amended. And it was properly seconded, and so I'll ask for a vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
It wasn't seconded.
Oh, sorry, I thought Mr. Oliver seconded before. I'm sorry.
Motion as amended.
You wouldn't have seconded because you were in opposition to it. So I'll ask for a second to that amended motion. Seconded by Mr. Lewis. Okay, all in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Opposed, yeah.
2, okay, and none abstain, so motion carries 3-2. Okay, that's the first component of this. The The second would be the structure. I think we'll have three components, if I'm not mistaken. I don't want to guide the motion, but there's, what's left is the structure and the pavers outside of the structure. And I will entertain a motion.
I move to deny the variance request for the structure and the pavers.
Okay. We have a motion to deny the structure and the pavers. Is there a second?
Second.
That's been properly seconded. Any discussion? And in that motion, so we don't have to do what we just did with the, as it pertains to the components in the application, those will apply to.
Yeah, maybe I was thinking about it differently, but if it's a deny, I didn't know if, I didn't think it would be necessary to go into those components, but.
Confirm that for me.
I think it's clear. If you just say no, it's no.
Okay, very good.
I think it's, if it does move to that, I see that as just being a little swampy mud pit right there. And so, does the approval of the previous variance allow, the turf to be replaced right there if removal of the structure were to be required?
Like, it would turn back to grass, essentially. I mean, it was grass before. Is that what you're asking, or?
That's the question, is if in the event that the structure is required to be removed and the pavers are to be removed, what is the remediation for that area? And is it required by this committee to?
I believe
provide
that Metro
guidance?
Stormwater would make the determination of the remediation to get it back up to code. It's my understanding of the regulations and procedures.
That would make sense to me. Ms. Ladd, could you confirm that for us?
If you agree that it must be removed, yeah, I would kick back to Stormwater to go back out and inspect after it's done.
I think they're asking what would it be returned to? I mean, if there's a previous condition that there was like a patio there or, something underneath where that structure was built, they could return it to that if it was approved in that original variance.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
I think that's what the question was, but.
Is that your question?
Right, so, yeah.
Or they could. Yeah, Roger is telling me that they would follow the buffer restoration if it's removed. And I'm going to defer to them, the stormwater staff. It would go back to stormwater staff. I'm going to defer to them as to what would happen to it if it was removed. It's not
Right, so in the event that it's removed, the applicant shall work with staff to develop an appropriate replacement for restoring that part of the buffer. Okay. So we have a motion to deny the request to leave the structure and the pavers in place. And the applicant will work with staff to develop an appropriate restoration of that buffer. Is there any other discussion? I see you contemplating something.
I just think it's going to do a lot of harm ripping that area up. But it's one thing to bring materials in and get things built, and then getting everything out of there is a problem. But
Okay, well, we
Just call the vote.
have a motion, and we have it seconded, and I'm happy to call the vote. So, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Aye. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry.
Opposed?
Opposed, two opposed. I didn't hear your vote. Aye, okay, so that's three in favor and two opposed, so that motion carries. Okay, so I think the piece to that is adding the, well, we've discussed it, it's in the tape, but working with staff to develop a restoration of that portion of the buffer. Okay, all right, so those are the two components. Was there anything else related to this case that we need to add since we broke from the standard items in the request? Logan, you satisfied with that?
I think so, yeah. I mean, what usually goes along with continuous mowing and maintenance is waiver of buffer signage, so I assume that was included, but.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you for your good presentation. All right. Okay. All right. If you don't mind, I'd like to take a 5-minute bathroom break. Or do we have anything else after this case? I'm sorry. Thank you for asking.
We don't, I mean, we were gonna do the ethics training, but we're doing that.
That's right.
Probably next month, so I don't know if
Okay.
we need to take a vote on that to move it.
I'll make a motion to move the training and adjourn.
Great. We have a motion. We have a second? Second. All in favor? Aye.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.